Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Mariam Ibrahim. Just to give you all an introduction to myself before I start, I am a human geographer and an assistant professor at LUMS, where I teach courses related to environment and development and methods of inquiry related to that. I'm also a former World Bank consultant and a former government consultant. And today I will be moderating this amazing panel on climate change and population growth and the impact of that on Pakistan and other countries. And we will be looking at the policy debates around it as well. Of course, when we look at population and climate change, thinking about all of this, concerns relating to population growth go back to, the Malthusian times. And Pakistan has had a focus on population growth for a long period of time. Concerns relating to climate change have come up rather recently and surfaced in terms of debates and policy debates. Ever since we've sort of been dealing with one environmental catastrophe after the other, and so climate change has become more talked about since then. To discuss this further, I'm moving on to the more important introductions. We have Dr. David Weil, and he's a very well-recognized name. You all probably know him, but just to give an introduction, Dr. David is a professor of economics at Brown University. He is a director of the James and Kathleen Stone Wealth and Income Inequality Project at Brown and a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Dr. Weil has written widely on a variety of aspects relating to economic growth, including empirical determinants of income variation among countries, the contribution of health improvements to growth, geographical determinants of development, the measurement of income inequality, population growth, climate change, and the list goes on. He has a textbook on growth that has been translated into 6 languages, and he's written widely on topics relating to demographics, health economics, looking at the gender wage gap, social security, and so on. And so he's a very well-known name, and alongside him we have Ali Tokishe, who is also very well known to all of us. He is a climate change specialist, and he focuses on low carbon and resilient development, international climate finance, and the just transition for an equitable world. He has engaged in the design, development, and delivery of several regional, subnational, national level projects where he's led teams of climate scientists, policy planners, think tanks, and activist groups. Currently, he's serving as the climate change senior advisor at the World Bank. He serves on the board of several nonprofit and private sector organizations as well. He is a member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council, and he is, of course, a frequent columnist who we've all read frequently on. He writes on climate and water related issues, and also familiar face we see often on Al Jazeera and BBC and so on. So welcome. I welcome you both to the panel today, and I would first like Dr. Weil to speak on his research, which is very interesting, and hoping to have a very interesting conversation after that.
What we're talking about is actually research in progress, so I'm going to tell you what we found. But if you make really good comments, then you can improve what we find, which it probably needs. So we addressed kind of 2 questions in this research, and I'll talk about them one at a time. So the first is just trying to understand the economic effects of climate change. So I'm not a natural scientist. I believe what the physicists and the geologists and so on are telling us about climate change. And I feel like one thing that I can do as an economist is try to translate that into a measure of the impact of climate change on the economy. And in particular, we're going to try to measure something we call climate damages. So climate damages is how much the income of a country will fall due to climate change relative to what it would have been had climate change not occurred. So that turns out to be a very hard problem. And I'll describe kind of 2 ways that you can try to answer that question. One that I think is not so good and one that I think is better. So one way you could do it is you could go to the climate change forecast and you could say, okay, what's the change in the climate, say, in Punjab going to be between now and the year 2100? And say they tell you that Punjab is going to get 3 degrees warmer. Well, then I could look at the record of production in Punjab, and I could look for some year in which it's unusually hot. Say it's 3 degrees warmer in some particular year, 2005. And I could ask what that did to agricultural production or what that did to production in general in Punjab, and infer from that that that's what's going to happen in the year 2100. Well, there's a really big problem with that approach, which has to do with this issue of adaptation. So if there's a single hot year now, that's a surprise to farmers. Their crops are not going to perform well. If the climate becomes permanently hotter, then farmers adjust. Farmers are very smart people. They'll plant different crops, they'll plant at a different time of year, they'll irrigate them differently, and so on. So then how can we answer the question? Well, another way we can answer the question would be to look for places that today have the climate that Punjab is going to have in the year 2100. And that's sort of the statistical basis of the methodology that we have in our paper. I'm not going to go further into the details of it, but we sort of implement that on a global scale, looking at a whole set of climate measures and very small geographic units. We kind of put this into a big processing mechanism, and that allows us to calculate climate damages for countries or for the world as a whole using these forecasts all the way out to the year 2100. So what do we find? Well, for the world as a whole, we find that the damages are on the order of 5%, which is not that big a number. So sort of, one takeaway from the paper might be, well, global warming is bad, but it's only kind of going to cost 5% of income. When you peel back that figure, however, things are much worse. There's a huge amount of heterogeneity. There are a lot of countries where, in fact, climate change is going to be good for output. Not surprisingly, those are countries that are far from the equator and generally very cold. In a lot of countries that are near the equator, climate change is going to have a much bigger effect. And of course, we know that those tend to be poorer countries. So there are countries that are affected as much as 33% by climate. In the case of Pakistan, the damages we calculate are 11%. So sort of one takeaway from the paper is that if climate change develops the way the physicists tell us it will, Pakistan is going to suffer climate damages of 11%. And the paper does this for every country. It looks at how it's related to income. As I said, poorer countries tend to be affected much more than richer countries. So that's kind of the first part of the paper, the climate part of the paper. The second part of the paper looks at the relationship between these climate effects and population growth. And the idea is to sort of think about population pressure on the land. So, Mariam mentioned Malthus, who's, he wrote 200 years ago, but he's still a super important economist. So you can think about kind of a ratio of the number of people to the amount of land. And that's what determines sort of population pressure. But of course, when you think about people per land, you'd want to adjust the quality of that land. So kind of 1,000 people on a square kilometer in Punjab have a much better lifestyle than 1,000 people on a square kilometer in Mongolia, where you can hardly grow anything. So think about this ratio of people to land. What's climate change going to do? It's going to shrink the denominator of that. It's going to reduce the quality of land, and that's going to raise population pressure. But the other thing that's going to happen over the next 80 years is that population is going to grow, and that's going to also raise population pressure. So in the second half of the paper, we sort of look on a country-by-country basis at these changes in land quality and in population and what their economic effects are going to be. And what we find is that for many, many poor countries, first of all, there's going to be kind of a double punch. Land quality is going to go down, and population is going to go up. And secondly, for many, many poor countries, the economic effect of that population growth is actually bigger than the economic effect of land quality decline. So in the case of Pakistan, where I told you that climate change by itself would reduce income by about 11%, when I put those two things together, population growth and climate change, that reduces income by about 33%. So Pakistan is one of the countries where the population effect is bigger than the climate effect. So that's sort of a summary of the results. I think we'll have a lot of time to talk about it, but I do want to sort of put in one very important caveat, which is something that we don't say in the paper. So we don't want you to read our paper and come away with the conclusion that climate change is not a problem and population growth is the problem, because those two things are very different. I mean, this is obvious in the case of Pakistan, where you just had this disastrous flooding that was due to climate change. And Pakistanis were justifiably angry because the climate change that's affecting Pakistan doesn't originate in Pakistan. It originates in the developed countries, which emitted all this carbon. So I wouldn't want you to sort of think that we're saying that, you know, countries like Pakistan should just worry about population, and rich countries don't need to worry about climate change because population is a bigger problem. Rich countries cause climate change. It's their fault. There's something that they have to worry about. So I don't want to sort of put these two things in the same basket. What we're trying to do is simply make some progress in empirically understanding the magnitudes of these effects. So I hope that explanation was clear, and I'll be happy to talk more about it.
Thank you so much for explaining the very dense paper in these amazing, concise way. I mean, related to what you just said about, thinking about, focusing on population growth and not focusing on climate change, and sort of, the trying to strike the balance between the two is something that I was thinking about when I also read the paper. I mean, if you look at the population of Pakistan, yes, we've probably crossed more than 230 million in terms of the total population, and that does bring in a significant burden on the government in terms of policy planning and so on. The taxable bracket of the country is also small, and in cases like, for example, you mentioned the flooding, in cases like these, the population burden, the population pressure is sort of really faced a bit more when you have to give compensations to people who faced the losses, people who lost their lives, people who were displaced, who lost their homes, and so on. So you feel that population burden at a time like that. But I had some statistics in terms of population growth rates, and I wanted to also ask this later on as well about the historical census data and how, if we look at urban and rural population growth, and since the 1970s, I mean, yes, there was an increase between 1961 to 1972, but post that, the urban population growth rate and the rural population growth rate has sort of decreased, right? So if I have some numbers down here. So, for example, in terms of urban areas, it decreased from being 4.92 between 1961 to 72 to being 3% up until 2017. And the same case was for rural areas, where it was 3.48% between 1961 to 72, and it decreased to about 2% by 2017. And that has, of course, to do with family planning programs and population control programs, and I mean, for years, for decades, we've been focusing on population control. And I mean, if anything, I remember from 30 years ago, it's that the family planning ads that stated "Do bachche hi kafi hain, 2 children are enough." From like 30 years ago, we've been focusing on that, right? But I mean, there hasn't been a very significant change in the population levels, and population is still increasing. It's still the problem that we're facing, and yes, population change occurs, and the pattern changes as there are socio-economic factors related to that. Population control programs have not always been successful, except for perhaps China, which had the one-child policy and then the related problems in relation to that. But then we look at climate change, and we look at how, let's look at last year, let's look at 2022, where we had one environmental catastrophe after the other. So we had so just to list it down with everybody, we had the untimely seasonal variation. So summer's coming in a bit too early, the mango production suffering, agricultural production suffering in that sense. We had the wildfires in Balochistan. We had the massive floods across the country. We had harsh winters, harsh summers. So all, climate-induced environmental catastrophes, right? And I mean, if you look at just the floods alone, significant damages in terms of human lives lost, people displaced. I mean, if you put numbers down to it, you know, there was a loss of more than 30 billion US dollars. And then reconstruction required another 16 billion US dollars, right? But really, going back to the beyond just the numbers, it really shook the really, you know, even the foundations of, you can say, people's socio-economic livelihoods, right? And like you said, you know, we are angry about it or whatever, upset about it, right? But the question that I want to ask you and Ali Sab is basically, you know, when we're looking at policies and when we're looking at really trying to strike the balance between the two, how do we do that? Because, you know, in discussions like these, we're building a narrative, right? So this narrative that we build is going to be translated into policies and into policy planning level. And I mean, so how do we put the two together? And so you know, in a country like Pakistan, where we focused on population control for a long period of time, and now we have all these climate-induced disasters. So, first, I would like to ask Ali Saab first, and then, of course, you as well. In relation to all of this, what are the current policies and the current policy approach in Pakistan? What has been done? What needs to be done to address these issues?
I think your paper is far more nuanced than your 2 minutes argument. So I want to be fair to you. But because there are many people sitting here who are neither demographers nor climate change specialists, so a reductionist presentation should not give them a message that, look, don't worry too much about climate change with the population, or the other way around. So I think it has to be seen in a context. We have often heard in Pakistan that our emissions are less than 1%. So the world is unfair to us. But oftentimes we don't say that there are another 100 countries that have emissions less than Pakistan. So the world is very unfair with at least 101 countries. And put together, the total emissions of all those countries will be probably less than the commercial flight that we had to the moon only recently, in which 1 or 2 billionaires paid a few billion and had a joyride, right? And their emissions are far more than 101 countries. In other words, probably what I'm saying is that more than number of people, it's the lifestyle that degrades the carrying capacity of ecosystems. It's the ecosystem, if protected, it can carry far more people than they presently do, and we cause more damage when we are not responsible, of course. Two biggest challenges we have going into the century, 21st century. One is climate change, and second, of course, is population poverty nexus. Now, my data is not fresh, but there are some people sitting here from the government. 120 million people, Punjab's population, roughly, more or less, and probably roughly the same amount of people below the poverty line, depending how do we define it. So by 2047, when we'll be 100 years old, Punjab's population will be, or Pakistan's population will be more than almost 350 million. And people below the poverty line will be, I don't know, probably roughly the same. So what is Punjab's population today will be the number of people below the poverty line, at least, that we will have going forward into 2050. Right? So the environmental cost, environmental damage of these people is probably what you're talking about, coupled with the temperature increase that we will have over the century, over the coming decades. As much as human beings degrade ecosystems and their carrying capacity, so does the increasing temperature and precipitations. So if it's 1.5 degrees, Pakistan has not reached 1.5 degrees yet. Many parts of Pakistan are still less than 1.5 degrees. That's the global average that we're trying to vault the global temperature on. But the chances are that it will probably not be arrested and will go beyond. Therefore, I want to see this question for this audience, at least who are that population does degrade the physical environment if not well sophisticated, educated, or responsible population, as we have the case in Pakistan. Therefore, it's not really the number of people as much as their lifestyles. If the lifestyle is consumptive, heavy, or irresponsible, that is a danger zone. There was recently a World Bank study, I think South Asia wide, money something, forgetting his name, who did cost of living, not cost of living, standard of living study in South Asia, including 9 districts of Pakistan. And as a modeler, they did some projections that how its standard of living is access to market roads and the education and access to electricity, and he picked several parameters, and we found that in both rural and urban areas, the quality of temperature will progressively go down as the temperature increases. It was not connected with the increase in population as much as it was with the temperature. I don't think it's a brilliant study, but it's an important study because it was the very first that I think at least I am familiar with. Now I just want to talk about a minute about Pakistan, then I'll leave it on you to react. We are not overly responsible in terms of our custodianship of environmental resources. Our water is polluted. Groundwater is also polluted, very heavily utilized. Land is degraded. Cropping patterns are changing, and in fact, we are changing the ecosystem to what I often call Punjabizing Balochistan and southern Punjab. If you grow cotton in certain areas, now we think Balochistan is fit for it or southern Punjab is fit for it. So it's monocropping culture. In many ways, we are degrading our own environment. While we are doing it, our ecosystems, or the quality of our ecosystem goes down, which would have been a natural adaptation strategy. And that is a very fundamental point that I want to make. In many of the developed countries, when they protect air and water and soil, they are enhancing the adaptation capacity of their population and their communities. Therefore, when extreme events happen, they are less vulnerable. Their resilience is better. Their losses are not as high as my colleague was just telling. It's scandalously high in our case. Therefore, the main point here is, while we are not very responsible, we are not adopted to an adaptation strategy, which is built in the development model if we had followed it. The result is that people are engaging in what in climate change they call autonomous adaptation, which means they make their decisions for the best of what they think in the judgment. And that means very heavy migration inward country, and oftentimes towards cities and capital cities of our 4 or 5 provinces. And if we look at the demographic trend, many of them, or probably majority of them, come from arid and semi-arid lands, not the irrigated agricultural lands. Which, in other words, it's a water or degraded land which forces them to go. In demographics and urbanization, I think that's a very important pattern for us. So therefore, I want you to tell us in a little bit more contextual sense. We are not particularly keen to curtail our population growth rate. As far as I was just talking to a colleague here, I don't know when is the last time a policymaker talked about population management or population control or whatever we used to call them. Then Musharraf was probably the only one who spoke last time around, but only in one speech. And as soon as the contract with the Americans was signed, we forgot about it. So we are not taking it very seriously. It is not to say it's not a serious issue, but I am still not convinced after listening to you that it's more serious than climate change.
Okay.
GT, please. Yeah, but she's the chair. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, I'll be careful.
Very interesting and very learning. So we are sitting here to learn about something, your research-based findings, the relationship between climate change and population growth. So climate change, when we say climate change is sometimes due to flooding, sometimes due to earthquakes, as in recent in Turkey and Syria and Pakistan, in case of flooding. So, have you done your research about this point that there is a particular relationship? One thing is, I think it is clear that there is inverse relationship between climate change and population growth. So, how much we can say that there is any particular inverse relationship between climate change and population growth, and based upon climate change, for example, if in case of flooding or in case of earthquakes, what are the suggestions about how what we do and the nation of any country should do about their population growth based upon climate change? So I think we should remain our focus upon this topic. So when we exclusively talk about just population matters and just talk about our climate, so we will not be able to understand. So topic is, I think, the relationship between climate change and population, and we should be given more opportunities to understand about the topic. So this is my
All right.
yes.
So thank you so much for the question, Dr. Weld. Would you like to first do saying, and of course,
I
this is
think
what.
very well elaborated different things.
Yeah.
But we should focus upon our topics.
Let's get back to the discussion.
I think Mr. Brown can respond this.
I will give it a shot. Let me turn your mic off just so.
G.
Still on.
Still happens.
Okay. So those were a lot of issues, and I don't think I can deal with all of them. But let me see if I can sort of pull together some of the threads. So one thing I want to start with is something that Maria mentioned, and I think was implicit in your question as well, which is how to think about some of the disastrous occurrences, flooding and similar things that are associated with climate change. And in the longer version of the paper, or in the longer version of my presentation, I have a lot more caveats and a lot more apologies. And one of them has to do with what's in the climate models that we work with. So we work with models that are made by physicists about what the climate's going to be in the year 2100. And so those cover temperature and precipitation and growing seasons and all sorts of things, from agriculture that I don't really understand. But one of the limitations of those models is that they don't do a good job of capturing cataclysmic events. So for whatever scientific or mathematical reason, climate models don't have hurricanes in them. We know there are hurricanes now, and we assume there'll be hurricanes in 2100. And there are reasons to think that hurricanes will be more frequent in the future, but that's not in the models. And so, we take what they give us, and then we process it through our technology. And so to the extent that they're missing something, we're missing it as well. And I can only apologize for that. I don't know how to fix that problem. So that's part of the answer to your question. I think one of the issues that's kind of present in all this is the question of, okay, well, what is the proper response to climate change on the part of a country, Pakistan? So, if you put me in the government and you said, what do you think the best thing to do about climate change is? And I think there's where we really have to put on the table something that you raised very explicitly, which is that Pakistan is a small contributor to a worldwide problem. And it would be nice if that problem was only due to billionaires going into space. But unfortunately, it's due to Germans living in big houses and Americans driving big cars and Japanese people eating red meat and so on. And economists have a word that we love using for thinking about problems like this, which is that it's an externality. The costs of climate change are not borne by the people who produce the climate change. So if the government of Pakistan were to say, climate change is a terrible problem, we're not going to mine our coal and we're not going to use that for producing power, we're going to put solar panels on everyone's roof, and we're going to cut down on our meat consumption, and we're going to do all these ecologically good things, that would have almost no effect on climate change in Pakistan. And that's the tragedy of it. And that's the political calculation that happens in Pakistan, and it happens in every other country, which is why this is such a devilishly hard problem. And frankly, if I were a politician in Pakistan, I would say, you know what? I'm not going to prioritize dealing with climate change. When the Americans and the French and the Japanese and so on get their carbon to zero, then maybe I'm going to address this issue. But till then, I'm going to take care of things at home. And I'm not going to say to my voters, I want you to suffer even more by not using electricity. And that's why it's just climate change is such a depressing problem to work on. So the last thing I want to pull out from, you raised many, many issues, is this question of quantitatively, do we think the impacts of population growth are bigger or smaller than the impacts of climate change? And there I can say, we tried to estimate this as best we could by looking, as I said, at sort of the forecast of what climate change will do to Pakistan in 100 years, and how those climate, how places that have a climate that looks like Pakistan's climate in the year 2100 fare today, and sort of we got the estimates that we got. I'm comfortable with those in part because of many of the things you said, which is that it's just really hard to pile up a lot of people on the same land. Pakistan has had unusually high population growth since independence, or even for the 20th century. And the UN forecast is that Pakistan's population in the year 2100 will be more than double the current population. So if you think about sort of taking every farm and cutting it in half, I think if you go to a farmer and you say, well, if I gave you half as much land, could you produce as much wheat? The answer would be no. And imagine taking every city and having twice as many people, twice as much sewage, twice as much groundwater withdrawal, and so on. I think it's credible that all of those all of those population pressures would have a very large economic effect. I don't want to sort of say, in saying that Pakistan has had a very high population growth and unusually slow fertility transition, I say that as a observation, not as a judgment. I think, with another hat on, I've thought a lot about optimal population growth. It's a very difficult moral question. It's a very difficult policy question. I think for governments to tell people how many children to have, it's a very, very fraught business. And, so I don't want to get into that business. So I say these all as kind of positive observations rather than sort of statements about what would have been better. But anyway, that's a partial answer to all those questions.
Can I add something?
Sure.
I know you have important questions to ask. I think you're absolutely right. I don't think we are essentially disagreeing with each other. Perhaps we are underlining two different pages of the same book, right? assume for a moment climate change was not an issue. This huge population growth rate will be an issue for us. And it's a very serious issue because probably every other baby born in this country is born in poverty. We can't feed, we cannot keep pace with this. And resource allocation has been progressively falling behind. For last 3 decades, if you see, we have not invested enough. And this is not population control, which is probably an offensive term in many contexts, but also providing clean drinking water, its sewerage, its housing, its streets, its street light, its parks, its schools. We lag behind on all social services that are called now environmental services for a healthy society. The World Bank study that I referred to, they used 4 or 5 parameters. One of them was health, another one was productivity, one was agriculture, and then probably something more, fifth one. On all those indicators, even if there is no climate change, we will be in bad shape. There's no doubt about this. But this is not an argument to say that because there is an increase or high rate of population increase in Pakistan, therefore climate change is a less serious issue. I think it was 1977 when Deng Xiaoping said 4 modernizations and 1 child, 1 family. This was 77, this is 23, and this is 2023, and this is the first year that they recorded decrease in population. It took 50 plus years. In the meanwhile, India's population probably has now is more than China's. In the meanwhile, so even if we have a very focused policy, we are quite a few years. I don't know what is the present projection for tapering down a population growth rate, but it's nowhere in my lifetime. Probably I don't want to guess about others, but we are half a century away from that. It's not a serious. I want to mention something. I want to mention something which very few people probably have focused in this country. I can share that with you. जी मैं आपको एक चीज पेश करता हूँ जो probably कम लोगों ने उस पर रिसर्च किया है. I just mentioned to you that the outward migration from arid and semi-arid areas is higher when they go to urban areas. Then our urban areas are not very welcoming. So it's essentially a sprawl in degraded lands and low-lying areas where they're more prone to floods and disasters and all that. Ill-planned, pardon me for saying this, cancer-like growth. Now, I just want to mention to you what does that mean in climate change context or health context in terms of emissions. It means that the lines of communication are stretched for miles and miles and miles. In absence of public transportation, it means higher emissions. And because they use, I was talking to one of your colleagues earlier, rickshaws and motorbikes, low-grade fuels, and because of congestion and narrow roads and low-grade fuel, very polluted air, very detrimental for their health. And in terms of our livelihood, long travel times, which essentially are very gender discriminatory. Imagine if you're a baby to carry, you have to look after a family and all that. Now, housing there, I worked in Karachi's heat wave, and the extreme events are particularly costly when there's a population density. In Karachi's heat wave, I was told that more people died because there were poor people who had come to Karachi during Ramadan. I found based on household survey that it was bogus. Their housing doesn't have ventilation, and these were elderly men and women whose children had gone out and they suffocated in their own homes. A very high percentage, because from 3 sides it's closed, it's only one better from where you enter. So my problem in this country is that even when my population is increasing, the policy maker is failing to provide planned growth of my urban areas and my cities. It is failing to provide us public transportation. If there are more passengers and they are paying, population growth rate will be good for that company. that's running this. So I want you to put that in a context for us, that yes, we are not saying we desire a higher population growth rate, but we are looking at what are management and policy or governance solutions available to us that help us for the next half a century or whatever decades it takes us to taper down our population growth rate.
Before we do that, can you also give us some information on how you would perhaps suggest we would be managing that? You know, in terms of what you've just suggested.
To God, I don't know, but one thing I do wish is that the hypocrisy of politicians and policymakers, we have to shed that. We oftentimes hear of examples from other Muslim countries, including this country where we are. That's a bogus reason for inaction. I think it has less to do with our faith and more to do with hypocritical approaches that our politicians have. This is my personal view. Many of you may not agree. But if you talk to those who work in population demographics, they'll tell you about the fertility and poverty and, you know, age of people, girls getting married, and there are many complex scientific issues that will need to be addressed. And based on that, we are quite a country mile away from what needs to be done.
Right. That is true. That is true. I do agree. I mean, there's a large societal change that needs to take place before we can even start thinking about a population perhaps decreasing, which brings us to our questions to you, where we want to ask related to what you also asked. I mean, we understand your findings, but when you think about it in terms of Pakistan, how do you mitigate these impacts? Like, what do you suggest should be mitigation strategies to address these issues? I mean, where we're thinking climate-induced disasters perhaps are the lesser evil, you can say. But how do you mitigate all of this together then?
I'm going to give a very short answer to both of your questions, which is there must be 25 people in this room who have better answers than I do. In all fairness, I've tried to sort of put together a very general model that can be applied to countries in a statistical sense. Every country is different. How to mitigate population and climate issues within Pakistan is just way beyond my expertise. So I'll let someone else answer.
Yes.
Tell us about your experience. We're all the time comparing ourselves with Bangladesh, which used to be a part of Pakistan, and it had a bigger population at the time of the breakup. And now they are doing very well in terms of economic growth and looking after the population, cities and so on. So in terms of your model, you said we are 33%, right? 11%. 11%.
If you let me check my paper, or if someone wants to pull it up from my website online while we're talking, there's a table at the back that has the answer to that. So other than that, I on the climate side, I don't know. On the population side, Pakistan and Bangladesh do have these very divergent fertility paths. So the total fertility rate, the number of children per woman in Bangladesh is now very close to the replacement rate. And so I'm not sure exactly, again, I could look it up, but Bangladesh is not projected to have anything near the population increase that Pakistan's going to have. As far as the effects of warming, as I say, our estimates are in the paper. Of course, Bangladesh is also one of the countries where you might worry that our model was not capturing all the problems, because Bangladesh, faces terrible problems from sea level rise. and that's not something we handle well. So I guess, putting those things together, if I look at the population effect relative to the climate effect, where I was trying to read the tables in the back of my paper, presumably the climate effect is bigger relative to population in Bangladesh than it is in Pakistan. But with a little time, I could answer the question better.
We can say that we can take some preemptive measures against any type of climate change by decreasing population growth.
So I hesitate to sort of, I think in a mathematical sense, what you say is correct, that there's going to be this rising population pressure, so more people and land degradation. And so because Pakistan can't affect world climate very much, the only thing that Pakistan can do to ameliorate that situation would be to have less population growth. The reason I'm reluctant to sort of say that's the right answer is because population growth is not like a little knob that you turn the way maybe monetary policy is. They're real people making decisions about children and their own lives. They care deeply about those things. In the case of China, you had a totalitarian government that kicked down people's doors and sterilized people or performed abortions or did all sorts of terrible things. And I don't think that's a policy to be recommended. So it's not as if you can sort of say Pakistan should have lower population growth and just make it so. And so therefore, it's certainly not my place, and I don't know whose place it would be to sort of say that is the solution. I'm much more comfortable simply trying to kind of quantify what the effects of these things would be.
My question is to Sir Ali. Sir, I have a layman's question. Actually, I belong to an area in Sindh where we have suffered 2010, 14 and 2022 floods. What happened last year is first there was drought and followed by heat wave and then the devastating floods. People first lost their livelihoods, crops, and subsequently they were washed away by the devastating floods. So when the layman gets to know about the climate change, the simple question is, as you also mentioned, that the emissions of Pakistan is less than 1%, and there are another 100 countries in the world whose emissions are less than 1%. So what scientific and rational reasons can be attributed to the extreme weather events and catastrophes that Pakistan is facing? Number one, is it an act of God that God chose us to suffer? Number two, is it the governance failure in Pakistan? Number three, is it the poor infrastructure due to which we are suffering? And as David also said, that even if we cut down our emissions and achieve net zero, so how would we get out of this conundrum? Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your excellent question, and I'm glad that you answered your question as well. In the present floods, the loss presented by government of Pakistan is 30.1 billion US. Broadly speaking, I've looked at the figures more closely. About 10 billion worth of loss is the private sector housing, your house, my house, other houses in Balochistan and Sindh in particular. That is attributable to, for the most part, poor housing standards. Construction of housing on the path of the water. And poor drawings, poor engineering, poor materials, poor governance control and regulations. It has less to do with climate change than poor infrastructure or infrastructural planning. If we reconstruct, and oftentimes when people are destitute, there's a hurry because winter was around the corner and the urgency is to give them shelter right away. And they'll reconstruct. And If there is another flood of similar type, they'll again be very, very vulnerable. So, leave climate change aside or population aside for a moment, think of having land use planning, see where the housing should be constructed, ask Engineering Council of Pakistan and the Engineers Institution to give us the pro-poor drawings, facilitate from private sector, banks and others, and help people come back with more resilient housing structures. Another 10 billion is government infrastructure of schools and hospitals, mostly, but also bridges and power stations and rest. And if I were an influential person, by now there should be a judicial commission to see why our procurement is so poor, why construction standards are so poor. And in my humble view, there may be some corruption, but I don't think we are talking about corruption here. We're talking about archaic construction standards and specifications. We have not revised them upward after the Raj. And their compliance is also very poor. That's where the foul play comes in. So it's the taxpayers' money. We'll have to invest them again. So it is your role and my role to ensure that the government of Punjab is sitting here, and we all, or one way or the other, have a voice. We need to ensure that the government improves its specifications. And if somebody asks me a difficult question, who is responsible about, population thing, I think there are 4 or 5 villains of Pakistan in this regard, and I've written about that. Nest Park is number 1, NHA is another one, NLC is another one, there's another construction, FOW is another one, and maybe there are, and then there are subcontractors. Now they have more or less monopolized all government of Pakistan construction. For one reason or the other, they are contracted, and they have not trained themselves to upgrade themselves, let alone with increasing temperatures, but also with increasing population and usage. So these 5 or 6 organizations, if I could have it my way, either they will be blacklisted, the public sector agencies, there should be investigations against them, but if we cannot do that for one reason or the other, at least don't elbow out private sector. Because government of Pakistan will never have 10 billion to reconstruct. So we'll have to attract private sector investments with improved standards. I hope I have answered your question. It's at the heart of it. More than climate change, it was the regulatory governance that we have. Now, since you mentioned Sindh, LBOD and RBOD trapped rainwater. It was standing there for months, and in some areas it may still be standing, which is a very difficult thing to explain. If you don't water overflow, you increase the height of the embankments, and then you create canals, and then you want them to be stronger, and you have created a passage where human settlements are. And if water cannot go back to the river, it cannot cross the river, and it's standing there, and there is infrastructure. So Sindh in particular, I think, is in for a very serious overhaul. And this maladaptation was financed by those who are supposed to know better than we do. So it's the World Bank that funded. I think it is their responsibility to undo that, so that there's a $10 billion worth of loss, 9.7 billion in Sindh alone, and most of it is coming from this. So my heart is with people of Sindh who are now stuck in vulnerability for a long period of time. And please remember, it was not the riverine flood. It came from Rajasthan and Gujarat in your case. GG. Pseudo. I can give a pseudo scientific response. There was a study commissioned by American Science Academy, American Science Academy, or whatever the name, together with Canadian government, to see that the glacial melt in the Australian ice regions is very huge, and the incidence of tremors has been higher there. Whether or not there is a correlation between the weight on the tectonic plates that is reducing and this. The study could not establish a definitive response. And I know after serious earthquakes around us and in Pakistan, there is oftentimes this question is raised, but this is not a science that one could answer.
I also looked it up at a point in time, and there are no it's inconclusive in terms of the relation between the two.
Correlation,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
So let me, Dr. David, thank you so much for your comments and the opportunity for us having in the presence of you visiting us. So let me ask you a more theoretical sort of question, right? I think you mentioned this, that this, the damage because of climate change is sort of, is treated as an externality by, by the economists, right? But then if you look at, there's a dichotomy because if you look at an individual country like, US, the Republicans and Democrats will be fighting over, the GDP growth is 4.75% or 3% or 2%, whatever have you. So that the way economists calculate the GDP numbers and the way the standard model in economics works is it does not take into account that externality that we're causing the rest of the world to suffer. You know what I mean? It's like when we talk about climate change, normally the language is like collective action and 1% here and the other party is doing more. So the whole framing is very collective, right, if you will. But when you talk about what really makes an impact, right, and where the decision making is happening, whether that's Congress in the US or Senate in the US, I mean, it's a very sort of regional, local perspective that's not capturing, the damage that you're going to cause to the rest of the world, right? So is there an opportunity for people like you, economists, to change this and, maybe create a deflator in GDP calculations because of all this that you're doing to the rest of the world and your brothers and sisters in the rest of the world? Because I think I see this tension in here that, there is, something that perhaps needs to be reconciled. So that's my one comment. And my my second comment was that with all due respect, I think one of the dangers in the way, just the title of your paper is that it sort of frames the discussion in a certain way, and we have sort of seen the currents of that over here, that we are, in parallel population control and then, climate control, it sort of muddies the argument, right? Shouldn't they be discussed in isolation? I'll just give you one example, because when you are at very high level, the conversations are not very deep. For example, in Pakistan, we have the standard sort of line that 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater, and that is incorrect. 1/3 of Pakistani districts were underwater, and a fraction of those 1/3 districts was underwater. So if you look at absolute area, it was not 1/3 of Pakistan underwater. Pakistan is a huge country. I mean, God forbid, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater. So I give you that example because I think that's how, your paper will get treated, because people say, oh, and for somebody here who's on the extreme right would say, look, it's an attempt to sort of, put the blame on Pakistanis that their growth is too high, and, it's really not, the climate change that's, causing the pain. So those are my two comments.
Thank you. I think those are excellent comments. Let me sort of take the second one first. I wrestle with that issue. I mean, I was going to jokingly say, no paper of mine has ever been so influential that it's going to do any of the damage that you attribute it to it. I think I write papers that get published in academic journals and get read by other pointy-headed people like me. But I do accept that point that, sort of scholars have responsibility for how their results are going to be interpreted. At the same time, I think it's it's good for the scholarly community to work to kind of have a reputation for neutrality. So economists would like to say, look, we're technicians, we're not moral philosophers, we're not politicians, we don't talk about how decisions are made, we just sort of tell you how things work, like, engineers would or something like that. So you certainly wouldn't want engineers to twist their results to get a certain answer, right? You'd like to think that kind of the engineers gave it to you straight. And so, maybe my defense would be to say, look, in the long run, it would just be better for scholars to give it to you straight, so you'll believe me, rather than to think every time an economist or a public health doctor or someone like that says something, that he or she is not saying what they think, they're saying what they think they should say to get you to do what they think the right thing would be. So that's the second part. To the first part, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that, yes, we can come up with measures of GDP that take into account all of these externalities. So you've probably seen literature on what's called green GDP, where we take conventional GDP and then we subtract environmental harms. And we can subtract the environmental harms that we do to our own country, we can subtract the environmental harms that we do to the whole world, and we can churn all those things out, and then we could say, look, Mr. or Ms. Politician, if you do such and such, it's going to lower income in the United States, but it's going to benefit the whole world. And so according to this index that I made, this green GDP index, things are going to be good. So you should do it. The bad news is that the politician would just fall off their chair laughing. And they would say, my voters don't care about the people in Pakistan. You're telling me that I should, limit carbon emissions here in the United States and destroy jobs and destroy the American standard of living for a bunch of people who don't live in this country and don't vote here. Well, I don't care what Professor Weil's green GDP thing says. I care about, money in the pockets of my voters here in my constituency. And that's the tragedy of it, is that politicians and the people who vote for them are self-interested. I think, if you could reform human nature so that people took into account the damage they did to other people, that would be fantastic. But, simply redefining terms by economists is not going to fix that problem.
So yes, as we all know, the crisis of climate change is looming over our heads, and we need to find a solution. And of course, I agree with the panel that yes, population control is one of the solutions, but we need to come up with immediate ones. Like for instance, in Pakistan, how do you face it? So maybe I'm not talking about finance, but how would you see the government in terms of budgetary allocations looking at climate change? When you are making budgets and you're involving government officers, but are you taking on board climate finance experts who do not belong to the government sector? Are you taking them on board? Are you taking their views and their opinions into account? One thing. Secondly, I think in this debate we also need to bring more focus towards the impact of climate change on gender, how it's impacting the women, and how many women are being included in the process when the government is talking about, because we all know it's a huge issue, but in terms of how it's, especially in the agriculture sector, many women are losing their jobs. So how would you see that? And I just wanted to urge not to, because see, it should be a very inclusive and participative process, and if you are not including women in it, then later 10 years down the lane you will be missing out 50% of the population in the entire debate. So that's the question.
I'll give one scientific and one probably practical or policy response. Scientific is that the Bible of climate change is IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There are thousands of scientists from all across, and it never covered population. And when it started, the speculation is, and I don't have the evidence, the Bush administration in the United States, as a typical response, they were not particularly keen for population control related issues to come. So it was pre-censored in the table of contents that that issue does not need to come to the scientific paper. And only the IPCC last report was 6th, if I'm not mistaken. It has covered population for the first time, and that too under health, a subheading. So in terms of mainstreaming population issue in climate change discourse, we really have a long way to go. The scientific community dealing with climate change has not focused, and the modelers can do. The models are very. You used 8.5 in GCM, right? The modelers are very sophisticated, and population-related data is very easily accessible. It's not a rocket science to bring the two communities together and have a locale specific responses. Now, coming to the policy question that you have asked in Pakistan's context, climate vulnerability is an extremely local issue. The responses have to be local. Regrettably, in Pakistan, they are top down. And the solution to that is only one. Unless there is a local government dealing with those issues that we just mentioned, drinking water and floods, passages or storm passages and so on and so forth, schools, building standards and all that, there's no solution to this. This will happen, keep happening. The world's patience and support is very thin. Don't expect that the world will come anytime soon if we are not willing to mend our own ways. So the local government will need to be empowered and resourced. Presently, they are neither empowered nor resourced. They are not empowered in the sense, for example, we have NDMA, it has a provincial counterpart, PDMS, but the district levels have not been notified. But even if they were to be notified, there's no link that they have with the local government, that elections that are happening in the country these days in different provinces. They're not linked. So they're standalone in their own silos. If you look at the terms of reference of the city mayor, let's say in Karachi, there's no role to play in relief and emergency services. He'll be just doing cosmetic media things by going there and distributing some water bottles. So by resourcing, I mean you have to really empower them by giving them a mandate that this is your responsibility. You can be elected or re-elected based on what you do. And financially, that means you have to revisit your NFC award. It's a distribution amongst friends at the federal and provincial levels. So the NFC awards, unless it reaches to the district level and the local level, is good for nothing as far as local vulnerability is concerned. So to address climate vulnerabilities, my last point with your permission. The West debate is very skewed in favor of mitigation. It oftentimes doesn't talk about adaptation. Now, I know, and all of us can see it on the website, Government of Pakistan, 42% of our emissions come from agriculture. So even emissions is at the heart of our adaptation. But what we don't see very often is that that adaptation or mitigation both will have co-benefits in economic development, creation of jobs and economy and green GDP or things of this sort. So for this kind of group, I think the central question is where are the co-benefits? Because otherwise politicians and others are not interested in climate change.
Right. Can we have the last two questions? I think we would have time for that, Zara. Okay, sure.
As the panelists talked about, there is a correlation between climate change and overpopulation. A very important aspect is the climate-induced migration, which is happening especially in northern areas where I belong. I belong to Chitral, where the glacial lake outburst floods are coming and there are extreme weather conditions. And due to that, people are migrating from rural areas to urban centers like Lahore, Karachi and Peshawar, Quetta. And there is already an urbanization going on in Pakistan, and that's putting a huge pressure on transport and all. And there is smoke going on in Lahore. There are different kind of issues we are facing in urban centers. My question from Ali Tokir Saab is, what policy measures can be taken to mitigate or to adapt to this to the climate-induced migration?
Can you take 2, 3, all of them in the final and we conclude? There's not much time. Thank you.
My question is from both of you, instead all of the panelists. I think that we have been not focusing over the role of science, specifically applied sciences and capitalism, in the very phenomena of behind climate change. Because when I go through the history of human civilization, I see that it was development in applied sciences which led to industrialization, and later on industrialization led to this phenomena of climate change. We have, as per my humble understanding, we have been focusing over the consequences and how to mitigate and become adaptable to them. But how do you view the role of science, and can it help us to tackle with the very phenomena of climate change? Because the thinkers about climate change are divided into two schools of thought, and one thinks that it cannot help us because the concept of science, and specifically applied science, is primarily responsible for the very phenomena, and the other thinkers which you also mentioned, they focus over the pattern of humanity and the way they are living and the way they are consuming. So how do you view it?
Women participation and then bringing through democratic transition, a lowering of the population growth. The markets, the way your markets are functioning, not ideally, but in the US, your markets are not supporting. Most of your libertarians, most of the people on the right of the middle are climate denialists. All your think tanks of this genre are climate denialists. So in terms of institutions as a country, and this mantra about markets, we get it from the West, right? Maybe we are ignorant about how to set up our own arrangements. That's why we depend on it. So in terms of handling these twin challenges, population growth and climate change, should we be pushing towards more democracy, more markets, or some kind of different kind of a balance? Learning from our neighbors from north with one-time policy, maybe not going out the whole hall, but that's why I started taking. I trained as an economist, but I've turned into a political economist. So I'm asking you this question: how do you respond the challenge we have in terms of addressing these two very large challenges in terms of how we organize our institutions?
All right. Well, I'll start with your question because I think it's easier than some of the other ones. I mean, it's true that there obviously, population growth is births minus deaths adjusted for migration, and so if there's sufficient out-migration, then the population won't grow so much. The UN figures that I quoted you attempt to include out-migration in it. So that doubling of Pakistan's population is net of all the people who are going to leave over the next 80 years. Now that could change. Migration could speed up dramatically in response to climate change or for other reasons. And when I presented this paper yesterday at the Lahore School, we discussed this, and I said, if I was president of the United States, I'd bring in a lot more migrants. But the political climate in most developed countries is relatively xenophobic just now. And so I don't think that there's really going to be that much migration, even in response to climate change. But in principle, you're right that one does have to figure that in. I'll try to answer sort of, your two questions about the role of science and the role of markets. So, you know this, but I'll say it for the rest of the group. Markets are good for some things, but economists have known, since Pigou or someone like that there are many things that markets are not good for. And even Adam Smith, who we, sort of celebrate as kind of the father of modern economics and so on, was very upfront about many cases where markets were not good. And externalities are one of those places where markets are not good. So if we wanted to unleash science to solve the problem, I mean, I've no doubt, first of all, that the solution to climate change is scientific development. The problem is that in the absence of policy, there's not much incentive to do that scientific development. So, imagine that you're an inventor and you're thinking of starting a company, and that company is going to find a way to produce electricity that doesn't emit so much carbon, but it's going to cost you billions and billions of dollars to create this technology. And you go to investors and you say, please invest in my company. They're going to say, well, why would someone buy your product? Right now I can buy gasoline and I can run my car on gasoline and emit the carbon, or I can buy your new fancy product and I can run the car without emitting carbon. Well, I don't care. I don't care about emitting carbon. It doesn't hurt me. So I'm not going to pay for your invention. And so your investors are not going to give you a couple of $1 billion to invest that. And so the science is not going to take place. Well, what's the solution to that? The solution, again, as economists have known since Pigou, is to have some kind of policy that taxes the externality, that incentivizes people to reduce their carbon footprint, and then they're going to hire you as the brilliant scientist and you're going to solve the problem. So markets paired with sensible policy are fantastic. Markets kind of in this, libertarian, no government interference thing are a disaster. Now, why the people in America who call themselves libertarians are also climate deniers, it's a very, very sad story. My personal view is that this has nothing to do with ideology, that these people have simply been bribed explicitly or implicitly by large corporations that don't want to pay taxes. And, shame on them for doing that. That's all I can say about those people. The last comment you made that maybe we should give up on democracy and kind of go for the China model. Okay, so you're right that in the case of China, when they decided to address the population issue, they addressed it, perhaps, certainly, in a manner that quashed human rights and human dignity and so on. The problem with non-democratic or totalitarian governments is they're very effective at doing good things. They're also very effective at doing bad things. And so, when Mr. Putin hears about climate change, and unfortunately, if Mr. Putin reads my paper, he's going to see that emitting a lot of carbon and warming up the environment is actually good for Russia. And that's an extremely depressing prospect. So, I don't think I'm really willing to give up on democracy just because it's doing poorly right now, because I think the alternatives, are all worse.
A quick question. Why do poor people often have more children?
Why do poor people often have more children? There's a lot of reasons for that. So part is the cultural or educational, worldview. More educated women are more likely to think about child health, to think about limiting the number of children so they can invest more in each. More educated men and women are more likely to have, let's just call them kind of modern attitudes, more secular, less religious, more forward-looking, less fatalistic. And they're also more likely to have the wherewithal to control their fertility. Also, people who live in cities, people who are higher income tend to invest more in each child. If you live on a farm, children can be very productive, even at a young age, and they're not very costly. You just kind of let them run around. If you live in a city, space is expensive, schooling is expensive, and so people tend to move from this kind of quantity of children to what they call higher quality of children. So somewhere in there is the reason.
And child mortality as well. I mean, the poor have less access to healthcare facilities, so they have children who they think, may not make it themselves.
Absolutely.
There 2-3 people asked about refugees. And in the climate context, because I see many students and younger people, it requires some research. There's the International Convention on Refugees, and refugees have the right to return in safety and dignity. This is a clause that oftentimes is mentioned. Then there are migrants. That depends on the receptivity or generosity of the receiving country. If I want to migrate to a country X, they may or may not accept that, and that's their sovereign prerogative. I don't have a right to migrate. It is their prerogative to decide. A climate displaced person is someone who does not have a place to go back to. So he is, in technical terms, is not even a refugee and is not even a migrant. And the world is searching for how to define the rights of climate-induced displaced person. For example, if there is a seawater rise in Sri Lanka or Fiji, where would those people go? And one of those countries in South Pacific has negotiated a treaty with Australia that if we sink, you'll accept our population as your citizens. Seawater intrusion in Bangladesh, somebody mentioned, is very high, and cyclones are very high. I had the opportunity to work on migration of refugees, climate-induced refugees, climate-induced displaced persons in 3 districts, based on mega data generated by phones. That people move in certain season, and after that they go back. So it's a temporary displacement for them. They know it's coming, and they go and find livelihoods in Dhaka or elsewhere. Satgira is a very famous district in that sense, in Dhaka. But then they go back. That mega data suggests people love their land, and even if the resources diminish, they go back, even if it's poverty or something. And there was a very small percentage, it's not a small percentage really, but compared to the anticipation that everybody goes and nobody comes back, the data suggested that 8% people stay. And even their return is delayed, and oftentimes they come back. So you came from northern areas, and because of gloves, people move now, and they become internally displaced. You can hear the ice cracking, and your livestock runs away with the fear, and villages move away, and then they come back. So within their own area, where they had lived for thousands of years, they have become nomadic or moving people, constantly moving in search of safety. So in the research domain, a lot of work needs to be done. And oftentimes we confuse economic refugees who go for economic incentives to Karachi or to Bombay or wherever. We confuse them with climate change. And I just gave you example from where I had done some work in arid and semi-arid areas. When the economic opportunities shrink, out of necessity they move. Now I can claim that they are climate, but I can also claim they are economic. So it's a very difficult area to dissect and research.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. I think we've gone past our time. Thank you so much for the insights on the paper, and thank you so much for your valued input. And thank you everyone for your questions and for attending the session. And yes, we were really happy to hear about your findings. Thank you so much.